que es un placer tenerla aquí. Él pertenece a lo que, sabéis que a los americanos, a los estadounidenses les gustan mucho los acrónimos, al GCI. El GCI es el GCI, sería el Getty Conservation Institute, o sea, un instituto de la Fundación Getty dedicado a la restauración del patrimonio, y tienen múltiples acciones, y algunas de ellas están centradas en lo que es la arquitectura de tierra. Es un lujo tener una persona de Los Ángeles aquí, pues, también considerando los medios que tenemos en la cátedra UNESCO, que son abundantes, que no son abundantes. Entonces, bueno, pues le agradecemos muchísimo estar aquí y que se haya ofrecido a dar esta charla. Y os dejo con todo. Yo os reserváis si queréis preguntas porque para después, porque la propia Fundación Getty tiene muchas iniciativas y es posible que alguno de vosotros os interese a lo mejor aplicar para alguna beca o algún estudio allí. Es decir, que hay muchas iniciativas y yo creo que está bien que aprovechéis para informaros. Bueno, de momento va a contarnos qué es lo que hace. Va a hablar en inglés, entiendo, ¿no?
Sí.
Vale. Si hay alguna duda o alguna cosa de estas, habla un poco de español, así que podemos solucionar.
Okay. Gracias, Fernando. Sí, yo voy a hablar inglés. Mi español no es tan bueno, so any question, but it's okay if you want to ask also in Spanish. So thank you very much for inviting me to give this lecture. I just want to say my colleague Claudia Cancino, who is also working on the Earth and Architecture Initiative, couldn't be here, so I'm covering some of the material that she would give. So the Getty Conservation Institute is a nonprofit foundation based in Los Angeles. I'm a conservator by training. I work in the Conservation Institute. So I'll just go through a little bit about what the Getty Conservation Institute is, what the departments of it are. Basically, we have 4 institutions. We have a museum. There's actually 2 museums, one that deals with classical antiquities and one that's a more broad general collection of fine arts. We also have a research institute, which is a big library devoted to art and architecture. And we have the foundation, which is kind of like a grant-giving organization that does grants for fine arts and architectural conservation. And then the Conservation Institute, where I work, which I'll talk a little bit more about. I just want to say also this is a great place to work. It's great to be in Los Angeles, but I'm considering moving to Spain after last night because this is, anyway. Okay, so the Conservation Institute has 3 departments: collections, which is dealing with mostly museum collections, so photographs, furniture, artifacts, and dealing with the museum environment. And then we have the science department, which is, of course, doing scientific research, and buildings and sites, which is the department that I work in and that Claudia, my colleague, works in. And our buildings and sites department covers quite a large range. Some people might say it's strange that you're working in Los Angeles on, I don't know, archaeology or different things, but for example, we have a Conserving Modern Architecture initiative, which is working right now on, I can use this. Yeah, this is Louis Kahn's Salk Institute, which is a very iconic modern building, also the Eames House, and many other initiatives for contemporary architecture. We're also doing projects on recording and documentation. Just tell me if I talk too fast or you can't understand anything also. This is better, huh? Okay. Sorry about that. You can't hear something? Okay. So under recording and documentation, for example, we're developing right now a GIS-based program for inventories of cultural heritage. This is for governments mainly, but also for private people dealing with recording large amounts of cultural heritage. That's being implemented. It's an open source website basically that you can use for inventorying heritage, and it's free to access. It's called Arches. And then we also have projects on historic cities and urban settlements, so how to design new infill buildings in the historic environment, and also dealing with planning measures for historic cities. And then archaeological site conservation and management. And the main projects for that at the moment are Roman mosaics in Tunisia, and this is King Tut's tomb, actually, where we're working right now on within the Valley of the Queens, doing mostly wall paintings conservation, but also site management. And just to finish off, we also work on conservation principles and methods. So we worked with the government of China to develop something called the China Principles, which is a sort of broad framework for how to approach the conservation of Chinese cultural sites. This is the Magao grottos on the upper left. And then a big part of the department is dedicated to decorative surfaces, so mainly mosaics, but also wall paintings, and how to treat and training for treatment of mosaics, wall paintings, and other decorative surfaces. And then the area that I'm specialized in, and also my colleague, is building materials. And so we have a couple of initiatives. One was training in stone conservation, and we're also working on the Earth and Architecture Initiative, which is what I'll talk to you about today. And within that, we're working in Morocco. We've just finished a project there at Casbah Tahrir, and in Peru. So I'm going to cover those, focus on those today. So the Earth and Architecture Initiative, it's a bit messed up there, is a broad project at the moment, really 3 areas. This is the team that's working on it at the moment. And we're currently working on seismic retrofitting, so traditional techniques for retrofitting historic adobe and rammed earth buildings, and also conservation and rehabilitation planning for earthen settlements in Morocco. And we're also currently working on a training course on conservation of earth and architecture. So I'll start with Morocco. This project is a partnership between the Getty Conservation Institute and the Center for Conservation and Rehabilitation of Architectural Patrimony in the Atlas region. It's a long name which stands for Circus. And we also worked with Carleton University, so sort of a 3-way partnership. I don't know how many have been to Morocco, but the south is one of the greatest repositories of earth and architecture in the world. And Circus, which has a staff of about 8 people, is tasked with managing, inventorying, and conserving quite a lot of it. And so they have focused a lot of their energies on the site on the right, which is Ait Ben Haddou. But there's also tons of sites, actually about 4,000 ksurs and kasbahs within these 2 valleys, actually 3 valleys within the south, and of course more in valleys that are in the northern mountains. So just some examples. Within the Dra Valley alone, we have thousands of earthen sites, some of them quite significant kasbahs, some of them are just villages. And the issue here is that people have mostly abandoned them, and so is how to deal with such a large collection of buildings and how to repurpose them, how to reuse them, and how to conserve them. So the goal of the project was really to develop a methodology for conserving the Kasbah that could be a model for similar sites, and that also would bring in a kind of holistic approach. So working with the local community, promoting earthen architecture as a material for new construction, as a material for historic restoration, and finding ways to repurpose these buildings. So the site that we ended up choosing to work on is Casbah Tahrir. This is actually also the center of where Circus works, so it's quite convenient in that way. And it's located in Ouarzazate, which is a city between the valleys, so it's well located. It's a huge site. It has various areas, and it's surrounded by this village, the Ksar, which dates from the 17th century. This building, the Qaid residence, was the home of the leader of the region, the Glaoui Qaid, who ruled Morocco for about a century during the French Protectorate, which is the French colonial period that ended in the 1950s. And most of this was abandoned. Some of it was a museum, but largely abandoned. So looking at the site, you can see that it's not only significant for the forms of the architecture, but the wall paintings, decorative surfaces, architectural forms of the buildings. Each one tends to have these courtyards in the center. And it's quite rare to have wall paintings such as this in a site. The history of the Kasbah is basically that it was at the intersection of trade routes between sub-Saharan Africa, so Timbuktu and regions like that, and the imperial cities of the north, so Marrakesh and Fez. And so it got quite wealthy from trade in gold, spices, and it grew as a center of power in the region, also a center of the community. When we approached Circus in 2011, the state of conservation was pretty bad. A lot of the roofs had collapsed, and it had been occupied by squatters, by people who really were not authorized to live there, who had constructed a lot of cement additions and various sort of illegal additions to the site. And this building was actually listed as National Heritage in 1954, which had a mixed blessing. It was protected, but then they also just sort of closed the key on the building. They turned the lock, and people basically forgot about it. So the methodology for the project, I won't go through all this, but was essentially to have a sort of research phase where we worked on the feasibility of the project, of course. We also researched the existing documentation and historical research, and prepared an architectural survey, which was quite a task because this is a building with about 300 rooms. So that's our baseline data, and then we worked both with the community to try to look at reuse ideas and the significance of the site to them, and also did, of course, physical condition assessment of the building. And then with these two things together, tried to kind of look at policies for the reuse of the site and create a rehabilitation proposal. And important within this project has been training all along, because Circus staff, the staff of our partner, didn't have experience with, for example, documentation really of sites. Also conservation plan. We produced a PDF plan, which is now available on our website, and I'll give you the website. And so we've tried to disseminate the methodology. So this is the team. On the top is the Circus staff. The middle is GCI, and then our various consultants for documentation, materials analysis, wall paintings, conservation, etc. So the first step of the project was really the architectural survey. This was done by a team from Carleton University. And as I said, training was a really important component of this, and trying to get into all these 300 rooms and various hidden spaces took quite a long time. So they developed, basically took points from the entire site and developed a point cloud model, which you can see part of. These are actually sort of like rectified images all put together. And then from these, we can develop cuts that are of course, the floor plans for each level of the building. And I'm not going to go into great detail about the architectural survey, but the results is that we had a complete floor plan, whereas before there was some sort of plan that had been based on the roof levels and was really not an accurate survey. So we really needed an accurate survey, and even within this survey we had some spaces that were almost hidden or were buried or were inaccessible. And of course sections of all the buildings, rectified elevations, and line drawing elevations for use in condition assessment of the whole structure. So then, of course, we use these buildings as base images to assess, structural conditions and various deterioration and to plan intervention. So this is just an example of a structural assessment where we were looking at separate wall separations, different building campaigns. The little purple circles on this are areas where we had structural cracking going throughout all the levels. And this is an example of the documentation of the decorative surfaces. So it's kind of a fly-through. It's a composition of rectified images, and it really shows you both the richness of the wall paintings, but also the terrible condition that they were in. These were mostly detached, stained. A lot was quite lost. And so this was also a big focus of the project, was wall paintings conservation, to try to stabilize and save these paintings. So we had a team, both internal and also from the Courtauld Institute, and they did documentation of the wall paintings, of course, photogrammetry, various condition assessment with raking light, also looking at the structural issues affecting the wall paintings, the supports of the paintings, and we found that there were many different layers of decoration throughout this painting, so we were trying to understand which is actually the original layers of painting. We did this through microscopy, through infrared thermography and ultraviolet images. This is an example of kind of the information that we could get from the multispectral imaging. So on the upper left you have visible light, and then and you see basically three reds that look quite similar, but then when you look at it in infrared, we see that we have it also looks similar actually in infrared, and then we see that we have something different here. So this is actually a completely different pigment, even though in visible light it looks the same. So this was the benefit of doing the multispectral imaging for wall paintings. And these are sort of compiled conditions assessment that the wall paintings conservators did, basically mapping areas of major risk, so detachment, staining, other structural cracks and issues like that. So another important part of this project was there was quite a lot of archival information, but the real history of the building was limited. Like written history was quite limited, so we actually did a fair amount of oral history. This is a guy called Da Lamajub, who was somewhere between 90 and 100, nobody knows exactly, but and he had lived in the Kasbah during really the height of the occupation by the Qaid family, by the ruling family. So this was between 1930 and 1950. And he remembered the use of the spaces, the names. The Qaid had something like 9 sons, 9 wives and 1 million children. So he remembered where they lived, what their names were, and various important aspects about the use of the site. Despite the lack of written information, we had tons of photographic information, but none of it was really organized. It was mostly just sort of in an archive in France, in an archive in Marrakesh, in random places. So we gathered the digital imagery into a database and sort of organized it by decade in order to track changes through the actual visible photography that had been done. This is just an example of like a postcard that was produced in the 30s of the Kasbah. And combining that sort of visual analysis with some archaeological study and some study on the site, we tried to identify which are the original walls, which are the walls that were there in the 1950s listing as a monument, and which are the walls that had been added by squatters that are cement or different partition materials, modern materials. So you can see the added walls in blue and the really rammed earth, mostly majority rammed earth walls in yellow. And I think I haven't really talked about the materials, but this building is 100% rammed earth until the third level, when it becomes adobe brick, where they do decoration and various openings. Okay, so based on that sort of study, we looked at the evolution of the Kasbah. So how did this kind of grow on the site? And we found that it was started as just a small religious building for veneration and a small residential structure that then grew through the 19th century, basically, with a small Kasbah beginning. This got added to, and then in the late 19th century, they really fortified the structure and built what we see today, partly because of warfare between different tribes. And then in the 20th century, we see like loss of the building, and this is indicated in yellow in the model. So where we're actually losing roofs with deterioration and abandonment. So this was more of a complete kind of phase mapping. And of course, each building could also have individual phases within it. And the other thing was to kind of understand the relation of the Kasbah to the town itself. So looking at the names of different, especially because they speak Berber there, so looking at the names in traditional language and how different spaces were used. So this is, of course, where they mixed earth. These were various gates. And then within, we have the residence of the Qaid, the residence where the women lived, where there was sort of military and slaves. And another important part of this project was trying to assess the values and the significance of this building, because actually there was a one-sentence statement of significance written in the 1950s that was completely inadequate. And so we wanted to rewrite basically a statement of significance and to try to really map that. And this is a hugely important building for Morocco. It's on the money, I mean, on the 50 dirham note. It's still important to the community, so you can see these sort of festivals that were had. They are still doing these musical performances. It's also had an economic impact on the community because it was used in filming. This is John Malkovich in the 1989 film called Under the Sheltering Sky. Terrible, terrible movie, but anyway, that's him. And then it's used in weddings. It's used, of course, as a tourist draw. And so it was really important to kind of identify these values and actually get them recorded somehow. And not only to record the values as a statement of significance, but also really looking at the physical fabric, what's valuable, what's architecturally significant. So this was a process that was done with circus and with the municipality, and it was not terribly easy actually, but for example, we look at the interiors of buildings, seeing that we have some pattern of 4 columns. And this is a significant feature within these buildings because it's a very traditional arrangement of space, but it had been quite broken up over time. So we wanted to map that as something that needed to be saved within the rehabilitation and to try to kind of assign values. So, and the open space has social value. And another thing which may seem obvious and somehow to us, but I think coming up with principles for the rehabilitation. This is a big project actually that was the Moroccan government granted something like 2 million dirham to do a conservation and rehabilitation project. And we wanted to create a set of guidelines or principles for rehabilitation. So these are quite self-evident things, but respecting the statement of significance, respecting the national heritage classification, preserving decorative elements, ensuring proper interpretation, opting for minimum intervention. These are things that we learn, but they're not actually explicitly stated in most projects in the region. And I highlight, I think we came up with 20 of these that are sort of guiding principles for the team. And I highlight number 3, which is to preserve original form, because for each principle we sort of developed rules for the guidelines for the design phase and guidelines for the operations phase. So for the design phase, it's specifying for consolidation, preserving the elements, specifying proper interpretation of elements, using protective measures during construction so things aren't damaged. And then guidelines for the operations phase means after the project is done, maintenance of these elements. It's a bit complicated to explain, but I think it's quite helpful for the project. And then working with the community to kind of come up with an overall vision for the site. It's a huge building. There's just thousands and thousands of square meters of space. So the overall vision was that Kasbah Tahrir is a sort of center of culture, economic development, and research for the cultures of earth and construction in the southeastern region, particularly in these pre-Saharan valleys. So the proposed uses of the spaces were as an ethnographic museum and research center for earth. So this is the Qaid residence, which has the most decorative finishes. A kind of residence for researchers or for also as a hotel. Workshops for traditional crafts. So there's a series of things like carpet making and various crafts that are ongoing in Ouarzazate. Traditional foods, cafe, and of course the most important uses are the ones that are already there. So we have circus offices and the Mediatek, which is an existing library that's used by the community and is actually a great example already of reuse of an earthen building. So part of implementing the actual conservation phase was sort of training and learning about earth and materials analysis. So we set up a laboratory and workshop where we basically, this was a lot of this was actually aimed towards developing grouts for the wall paintings, but also materials for the conservation. So these are basic tests: sedimentation, granulometry, various characterization tests to compare. We actually only had 2 different types of earth, really, that we could use potentially as sources. And this is a test called the Carrasas test, and it's actually a didactic test used to basically demonstrate how water affects different types of earth. Different amounts of water affect one type of earth. So adding more water, you see that the earth like sort of melts, or the best sort of plastic state for earth. In terms of the rehabilitation project, this was carried out over a relatively short period of time for our standards, by both circus as well as contractors who are specialized in earthen buildings, and the municipality. So it began with emergency stabilization, which I'll show a couple of examples of some really critical walls that had been leaning, or towers that were cracked. Also removing debris. We removed hundreds of tons of litter and even waste. Horrible, actually, situation. And then this demolition of recent additions, so the additions that had happened in the 90s and 2000 that were in cement and, I don't know, corrugated steel and things like that. And then reconstruction of roofs. Most of the roofs were not salvageable in this building. This is an example of the emergency intervention. We had a wall that was completely unstable. It had detached from the whole building. So it was affected by raising damp, also by rain coming in, and so this was supported with shoring. And for structural interventions, of course, we had tons of cracking of separation of walls on the site. And these were mostly fixed using relatively traditional techniques in Morocco. This is something that they actually know how to do quite well still. So using wooden ties to stitch the material, you can see that here, and then with fired brick to close the gap. This is another example. This wall was far gone, and so it was partially demolished, and then a new bit of rammed earth was kind of inserted in order to retain the fabric around it, but to stabilize that area. The mud bricks for the project, there was rammed earth and mud brick produced in 2 different sizes: large size mud brick for structural things like walls, and then a smaller size brick that was used for decorative elements, for like cornices, capitals, that sort of thing. And the roofs, as I said, most roofs were either missing or had collapsed, and so new roofs were done. We saved roofs where we could, but in most cases, beams were brought from the mountain area, treated, and new roofs were created. Much of it using this traditional technique called tataouille, which is different layers of reed applied so that it creates a kind of decorative pattern. So we have a very plain one on this side of 3 different levels. This is a more traditional one using 3 different natural dyes and putting it into a pattern. And this is something that we found within the building as well. For the wall paintings conservation, I won't go into great detail about that, but we basically tested a series of earthen grouts using mainly the earth that's there, some lime and some natural plant materials, and did grout injection and edging repairs of the wall paintings, as well as cleaning. So I just show you a couple of before and after examples, and I think what's important to keep in mind here is that these buildings are going to be used as living heritage. I mean, not living heritage, but as reused spaces. And so the surfaces and things like that we might find kind of charming, it wasn't really acceptable to keep the surfaces in a deteriorated state. So these are the final results. We kept, for example, the form, the apertures, all of that stuff, the spaces, kept everything as we could. But of course, the wall plasters are added. So just a few examples of before and after. And inside, I'll show you an example of that. So this is repair of this partially collapsed tower. Also, space on the right. In the interiors, we attempted to make these really habitable spaces. So where we had, for example, here we had existing windows that had been blocked up. So these were opened and made into a habitable space. So that is essentially the site. Currently, the last phase of the project was dissemination, so we created a website with Circus to collect all the documents from the project. We've also published this report, which I would say about 90% of it is study of the site and of the wall paintings and implementation. So if you're interested in that, it's available on our website. I can give you the links for that. So that's essentially Morocco. And the next project I want to talk about is the Seismic Retrofitting project. This project grew out of, really out of an earthquake that happened in Los Angeles in 1994 called the Northridge earthquake. It was a 7-point earthquake which damaged a lot of the colonial adobe buildings in Los Angeles. And so they brought together experts to study seismic retrofitting techniques for adobe buildings. And those experts made a recommendation at the time that there needed to be more research towards low-cost seismic retrofitting approaches for residential, for basic earthen buildings. So the objectives of this project was, as I said, to design kind of low-tech but effective seismic retrofitting techniques that can be used with local expertise for, and in this case we focused on Peru, for Peruvian historic buildings. We wanted to test and model the scientific data and demonstrate the validity of these retrofitting techniques, and also to obtain kind of a national recognition so that we could disseminate the methodologies within Peru, and to do a model conservation project which demonstrates these sort of traditional techniques or low-cost techniques. And also to develop site assessments and implementation guidelines for the implementation. Excuse me. So again, the methodology looks similar, but we wanted to select a group of prototype buildings to focus on. We did this in collaboration with a peer review group of engineers. Of course, then site survey, non-destructive testing, and various investigations of these buildings to kind of develop an overall condition assessment of the site. The second phase has been the testing and modeling, so static testing, in situ tests, doing, of course, the modeling analysis, and I'll show you the models that we developed for that. And then testing both very traditional retrofitting techniques, sort of middle of the road, and then high-tech retrofitting techniques. And then, of course, again, dissemination, so technical guidelines, manuals for implementing these techniques and workshops, and also the model conservation project, which I will talk about a little bit. So this project had a huge series of team members, mostly because of the modeling and analysis. It was a collaboration between the Getty, between the PUCP, the Pontificia Catholic University in Peru, and the University of Minho with Paulo Lorenzo, and the Peruvian Ministry of Culture, which is a very well staffed and organized Ministry of Culture. And then we had a 12-member peer review group that reviewed the modeling data and made recommendations about the direction of the project. So the 4 prototype buildings, I will not do the history of each one of these, but I'll talk specifically about a couple of them. This is Ica Cathedral on the upper left, which is in Lima. Hotel El Comercio in Lima as well. This is the Church of Cuño Tambo, excuse me, and this is high in the Andes Mountains in Peru. And then Casa Arenal, which is a regular sort of residential building. So these were supposed to reflect different types of constructions, but always earthen materials. So this is Ica Cathedral. Ica was heavily damaged in the 2007 Pisco earthquake, which was 7.9 on the Richter scale. And so quite a lot of study went into the building after that. Main deterioration was the collapse of the barrel vault roofs. These are made of quincha. Quincha is reeds with mud applied to it. It's a lightweight system, but unfortunately there was also adobe sort of voussoirs that were in there and wood which collapsed. And even you can see the base of the building also suffered quite a lot of shaking, and so those columns and things were deteriorated. The initial phases of the project were sort of looking at the structural system, which turned out to be quite complicated. This is a 1757 building built in the 18th century. Quite an interesting system of construction. Also looking, for example, at what even the original paint schemes were, because this helped to inform where there had been structural changes over time. And again, a peer review group was brought together, and part of the complexity of this project was working with the diocese, because the diocese had their own goals for the conservation of the project, and to kind of come up with a methodology for how to approach this project. So this is the peer review group beginning in July 2011. And some of the early phases of the project was testing the sort of doing structural analysis. So this is at PUCP laboratories, testing, for example, shear wall strength of all the materials, of adobe walls, rammed earth walls, quincha panels, mortars, and the various earthen bricks and materials that we had there. Claudia would probably go more into what the testing methods were, but as you can see, I think this one is a compression test. But and in order to have accurate data, of course, we had to actually identify the properties of these materials and really look at the construction techniques. So looking at how this failed, what the foundations were made of, what the actual connections were. So in order to have an accurate model to really understand the construction and failure mechanisms. So this is impact echo testing of both mortars and the bricks. And this informed also the data for the modeling. So models were developed for each building. The models, were modal analysis, gravity loading, indirect pushover analysis, and time history. Claudia was going to give this part, so and so for that kind of informed the overall model, which I'll show you next. So these are the models. This is for ICA, and as you can see, ICA is almost largely a wooden building with earthen walls. So this is a relatively large magnitude earthquake, and what we saw was that, of course, the points of major stress were within the barrel vault, and that any sort of strengthening program needs to deal with strengthening of the barrel vault. Then at Ica Cathedral, we understood that some of the traditional techniques of retrofitting are already there, such as buttresses or the way that the walls were connected with beams. But then we had a couple of very vulnerable points. So this unreinforced wall or the gables of the roofs. So this was, because it was 4 prototype buildings, quite a lot of testing and research. It was a huge amount of work to actually produce construction drawings and then to try to turn this into an implementation project. So at the moment, we have really only begun implementing and at the Cuñutambo site, which is the smaller church. So I'll talk a little bit more in detail about that. This is just showing that the different stakeholders. So the community in Cuñutambo, we had 500 community members who had actually written a letter requesting that something be done because their church was basically uninhabitable after the 2007 earthquake. This is our director, Susan McDonald, and just dealing with the kind of the community, the diocese, the ministry, and the various stakeholders. So this is the presentation of the construction drawings actually for ICA. So that's mostly where we are now, is the final construction drawings and the proposal for various seismic things. But I think I'm going to talk more in detail about Kunyatambo, because that's where most work has been focused. Kunyatambo is a 17th century church with basically all adobe but very wide walls. It's in a tiny village in the mountains in this village called Kunyatambo, and it's like a 2-hour car ride over really rough roads. Sorry, 5-hour car ride over rough roads. So it's quite inaccessible, but the community really pushed to have something done because this was their only church. It also has extensive wall paintings inside. So the project also for this one really began in earnest about 4 years ago, and we brought together a team of people to start working on it, tried to present it in various venues. So we began with the actual architectural survey, so doing the construction drawings again. This is the community doing, once the construction drawings were presented, doing kind of a ceremony for that. And what's significant about this church is the preservation of the wall paintings. These wall paintings are, as I said, early 17th century, really beautiful but quite damaged. And so you have this challenge of retrofitting while you have an entire surface on the interior that needs to be protected. So developing techniques for that. And Kunyatambo is similar actually to other churches in Peru in that it has this kind of roof structure, not as complex as this one. But what's really different is that in most churches in Peru, the wall paintings have actually already been removed, conserved, and put back using this technique called strappo, which is, I think in the 60s there was a lot of Italian conservators, not to blame it, but working in Peru which were using this technique. And as you can see in this one, we have these faint lines. This is where the painting was actually taken off. This is a different church. Whereas in Kunyatambo, the wall paintings are really in situ, and so we wanted to avoid any kind of interruption or obstruction of the wall paintings. So of course, survey was done. These are the rectified images of the wall paintings and surfaces. This was done again with Carleton University. And we looked at the existing conditions of the wall paintings, so areas of detachment, cracks, loss, developing this documentation. And I think this is just, this is another example of, we had a huge amount of loss because in the 2007 earthquake, the beams of the church sort of like shifted back and forth. And so quite a lot of the wall paintings at the top of the roof were detached. So the earliest phase of the project was really developing treatments for the wall paintings. The grouts, this is the technicians developing grout treatment. Grouts were based on local earth, a cactus kind of gum that was used, and micro balloons actually. And so this was the injection grout, also used as an edging repair material. Just some examples of the conservation work going on, and you can see the construction of the roof. This is actually part of a sort of temporary roof. And this is just implementation of the actual wall paintings treatment on the site. Just another example of kind of grouting, and you can see also that they're tracking where they're actually treating the wall paintings. So this is a post-treatment documentation. So here they're noting where they've done edging and where grout injection has been done, and you can identify this by tapping to know that this area is now secure because the grout is fixing it to the substrate. So go in a little more detail about the proposed structural interventions on this building. And as again, I think my colleague would talk about this a little more in depth, but basically the proposed structural interventions were dealing with strengthening the roof, so placing wall plates on top of the walls, renewed kind of tie beams. This is an A-frame structure roof, and anchor keys, which would keep the roof from, from moving in the earthquake. Also, wooden corner keys, which would keep walls from separating. Additional buttresses and basic restoration of the adobe wall and stone base. So this is just a schematic drawing, axonometric drawing of the roof structure, and what Kunyatambo is missing in many cases is a tie beam, and so that leaves the roof quite vulnerable to kind of collapse and separation. So part of the goal there was to put new tie beams in. With new tie beams, it also was going to be strengthened by placing these keys, which stop the beams from basically moving back and forth. So the most traditional system is that the beam is just kind of sitting out in the wall, but in this case we have wooden ties which actually link it to the wall. This is called parinudillo, if this is correct. I don't know. Yeah. And then really important is this is a traditional system that's been used in many buildings, as you can see throughout Peru also, is that there's these wooden corner keys, and these sometimes were built purposefully within the new construction. In our case, in Kunyatambo, there's nothing there, and so the insertion of diagonal wooden keys to actually pull the walls together so we don't have lateral movement separating at the corners. So this is an example of corner keys. And part of the testing at PUCP was to see how these keys would function, with lateral pressure. And this is just an example of the testing. I'm sorry, I'm not a structural engineer, actually. I'm a materials person, but not a structural engineer, so it's more that I can show you this. And then this is an example of buttressing. Actually, these buttresses were really not tied to the original structure of the wall. They were kind of built up to strengthen it, but without really real connection. And so doing wooden keys which connect the buttresses to the actual wall, and then the addition of other buttresses, though this changes the visual aspect of the building from the exterior, it's a really important traditional method of conservation. And then basic repairs, so trying to strengthen the foundation, which had been heavily eroded through basal erosion, and obviously fixing repairs like this, which are just sticks stuck in there. So actually doing the repairs. And this stuff is ongoing. This work has begun. The wall paintings conservation work is ongoing, and we're starting now the implementation of the structural repairs, which I've shown you. So that is essentially it. The website, getty.edu/conservation, is a big website, but if you look on field projects, buildings and sites, you can find Earth and Architecture Initiative, you can find all kinds of information. We also have a huge amount of information about publications on our website, so free PDF publications. If you want print versions, you can even order it, and it's shipped around the world. And so I'm happy to answer any questions. That's about it.